It's Just Business with Steve Thomas and your host, Chris Larry.
Hello and welcome to It's Just Business on the Hogstein Network, the show where we look at the dollars and the cents and the cryptocurrency of the sports media business industrial complex. Steve, how you doing today?
It does seem like we're always doing cryptocurrency stories, doesn't it? We considered another one that we're going to skip for this show, but seems like there's always cryptocurrency. I have not one penny in cryptocurrency, which probably ought to surprise no one if you really know me. Bill, but everything is okay here. You know, it's the downtime in the football calendar, so we have to create other things to do. I think, fortunately for most people, not me, since I've given up, but most people are finding probably the basketball playoffs entertaining this year, I would assume. Because the scores and the stories I see look like basketball is going pretty well. So I think that's probably keeping most people's attention in sports right now.
At least a segment. There's some of the numbers which suggest not that many people.
Their ratings have been in the tank for years.
Yeah, that is what's probably sent for the hardcore sports fan. That's what season this is right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
And actually, I've said for a number of years here on the show that I just have not been interested in the NBA purely on sports entertainment grounds. But I actually have been thinking about dipping my toe back in on this second round just because it's as wide open as it's ever been. I mean, not a lot, really, who knows who's going to win? And the NBA might be looking at Milwaukee, Utah final, which would make me laugh heartily.
It will make the NBA want to jump off the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I haven't been interested in the NBA because they're beating me over the head with social justice things and telling me I'm a racist. So that's why I'm not interested. But yeah, I think it's certainly like Milwaukee, Utah is just the worst for a league that's been struggling with ratings anyway for a variety of reasons, which we've talked about. I think that's just a disaster. I mean, nobody's going to watch that at all. At least if they were having Brooklyn is probably who they're rooting for at this point, I think. Now if the Lakers are out, Brooklyn's probably, but if they don't get in, man, the NBA is going to have trouble.
I would imagine the NBA league offices are rooting hard and telling their refs that they would like to see Brooklyn versus LA, which still makes me laugh because that's their best case scenario is the two B-level teams in the two big cities.
Yeah, I know. And by rooting for LA, what they mean is paying their refs to make calls which will allow it to happen, which the NBA has a precedent for, maybe not them paying the refs, but refs being paid is something that has happened, as we know. It's a shame we didn't have a podcast when that story was coming out, because we would have had a field day. No, yeah, it is kind of interesting that you've got the B teams, and with the case of the Clippers, it's more like they're the C team, not the B team, and there is no B team. But I don't know, but you're a New Yorker, Chris. I mean, doesn't Brooklyn have a little bit more cachet now than it used to, though?
Not really. I think they're still sort of seen as Johnny-come-latelys. It still doesn't, even as bad and, on all the ways you can define bad in terms of the New York Knicks, mostly, off the court is the biggest problem. But the Knicks still hold New Yorkers' hearts. I don't think, we see if they win the championship, all things change. But I don't think that they're still not that big a deal, honestly. I think they're still akin to the Clippers.
Interesting. The Knicks' problem really is that they've got an elite level ninny as the owner. I think if you get past James Dolan, I think James Dolan by himself has ruined the New York Knicks brand.
Oh, definitely. No, I mean, everyone would love to see the celebrity death match between Snyder and that would really be the battle royale for the worst owners in sports.
Would you switch Snyder for Dolan for Washington?
Oh, that's a good question. No, and because you can make the case that Dolan's ruined 2 franchises, so he gets the nod. So no, you would not want him.
Yeah, I agree. And the reason is Snyder at least doesn't have contempt for the game and the players. Dolan does. Dolan's the guy who's gotten legends arrested, thrown out of arenas and charged with assault for, all that stuff for no reason at all. So, yeah, for those of you thinking Dan Snyder's the worst, James Dolan has got him beat.
And at least we don't have to put up with Dan Snyder's horribly embarrassing blues rock band, which is the only thing Dolan actually cares about.
Yeah, instead of his multi-billion-dollar industry.
Yeah. All right. Well, we better move on to our first real story of the day, which is the NFL. Not on it is the quiet season, but definitely an interesting wrinkle in the concussion settlement and that ongoing payouts, having to do with basically how they are using race norming medical practices to judge payouts to black players. Really kind of a fascinating story. I'm surprised it kind of came. What was the concussion lawsuit? It was probably 6 years ago ish, something like that. It's been a chunk of time. So really surprised that this is there, and then it took this long to kind of bubble up. But now there's lawsuits, and now it's a legitimate story and is in the courts.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And okay, so first of all, I think it's weird that the media hasn't made a bigger deal out of this, but I have a theory as to that why. But what I'm reading in front of me is from ESPN called NFL to Halt Race Norming, Review Black Claims in $1 billion Concussion Settlement. I also saw this on the Daily Wire and a couple other places you want to try to find it. This is from the 2nd of June. So what Chris is talking about here is that the NFL, in administration of the settlement funds for the concussion lawsuit, and to back up, many years ago, like Chris said, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago at least, there was a class action lawsuit against the NFL that alleged that the NFL knew about the cognitive damage that occurs to players in the course of playing professional football, and they hid the data, didn't tell them, and so there was a massive multi-billion-dollar settlement of this thing. Now, what the NFL was apparently doing is this. In order to determine the amount of payoffs that these players get, they'd have the medical doctors evaluate the player's cognitive function, okay? Meaning, see what kind of mental damage has taken place. What the NFL was allowed, and apparently was not mandatory but optional, was that they established a baseline cognitive function, meaning the amount of damage is determined by the difference between the baseline and where you ended up. Now, the NFL allowed the medical community to use a normative baseline for African American players that was lower than other ethnic groups. In other words, the NFL allowed doctors to say, because you're African American, you're going to start with a lower amount of brain power, which subsequently would reduce your award, because no matter where you ended up, if you start lower, the amount of damage you suffered was lower. And the obvious serious problem with this is that race has absolutely nothing to do with cognitive function. Now, I think, Chris, that if I had to guess, I think what's going on here is you've got a bunch of insurance actuarial types who are trying to come up with a process. Because if you buy life insurance, there's massive amounts of charts, and people do this, professionals, for a living. But just as an example, if you were a big, giant, fat guy and you have diabetes and you're 65, they know to charge you a whole lot more for life insurance if you could get it at all than if you were a 20-something healthy female who is in a much lower risk group. That's probably the type of people who are probably doing this, would be my guess. But I think it's just baseline, discriminatory, illegal to do this. And I don't know who thought this was a great idea. It's an amazing story.
Yeah, I was kind of, when the headline started to puncture my media consciousness earlier, about midweek, right? It was the story sort of broke. I was sort of dumbfounded that this was even an issue, and that this would be allowed in such a high level case and settlement, and then it's got such, and I know, and I'm not a doctor, no medical advice here, but and so I know that there's a claim that there's some medical theory basis here that actually was intended to kind of do the opposite. I find that to be, kind of very easy retrofitting here to wash the story, because, whether it's the bell curve, the infamous book by Charles Murray, or others, you go back. This is if you want to debate what is and isn't systemic racism, which it's not really here to do. This is what you would cite. These are the kind of things you'd point to.
This is systemic racism.
Yes.
This is literally systemic racism.
Yeah, and if you go back to, even the justifications for slavery, it's these, medical and cognitive differences to justify actions. So this is a deeply embedded rationale for these kinds of things. So it just connects to really what is 300-400 years of that kind of race-based, decision making on all accounts. So to have something that here now is still linked to that kind of thinking is remarkable. And then I also, this deep cynic in me says, well, this is a mitigation against over payouts, right? Because the majority of, even going back historically, because this reaches back to players who have been out of the game for 30 some odd years, right? Still, the majority of players are black, and so you're making it harder for payouts to go to who the majority of the players or recipients would be. That seems to be, in a kind of the actuary type of mentality, that seems to be a loaded thing.
Well, yeah, that's what I said. I think these are actuarial types that are doing this, clearly, right? When I first texted you about this, like midweek, I said I want to do this, but I really need to look into it. And the reason why is I just could not fathom that this was accurate. There had to be another explanation for the story, and it turns out there really isn't. And yes, the NFL's response to it was, I don't understand their response, but the response was, we were doing this to eliminate bias. I don't know how you establish a norm based on skin color or ethnicity and claim that you're eliminating bias. It's truly mind-boggling. Now, credit to figuring this out goes to Najee Davenport, who most people who are football fans would know, and another player who I'm not familiar, don't remember, at least Kevin Henry. They are the ones, they sued the NFL over this. So they're the ones that first brought this to light. I'm not quite sure how the NFL and the AP and the Daily Wire picked this up this week, necessarily, because there didn't seem to be anything that really happened. But I think all of this is definitely, as you said, Chris, I totally agree with you on this. This is just a way to reduce settlement amounts. That's all it is. They want to reduce settlement amounts, and the way to do that is, like I said, how you calculate damages in a case like this would be, say, okay, here's where you started in terms of your cognitive ability, and here's where you ended up, and the difference is used to calculate the financial reward. So if you start with a lower baseline, there's going to be a less of a difference in where you started and where you ended up, and so then your award is different, and that's what's going on here. And again, this is just like insurance nerds, actuarial people doing this. But it truly does go back, like you said, you go all the way back to slavery, when the common belief, which is, obviously been, doesn't exist in today's world, except apparently for the NFL, the belief was that the African slaves had, weren't human, and, they had less abilities and all of that. That's sort of what it harkens back to. And it's just the NFL ought to be ashamed of itself for even if, okay, NFL wants to save money, fine. Who in the league office saw this and said, yeah, this is the right thing to do? Did anybody know? I find it a little difficult to believe like Roger Goodell and the senior NFL staff and the owners really understood this, because this is also a very, very technical thing. So I tend to believe that had they really understood, they wouldn't have been this dumb. So I kind of think that nobody really knew what was going on. I'm going to give the NFL the benefit of the doubt. Maybe I shouldn't, but that's sort of what I think happened.
Yeah, obviously I don't know enough to say either way. But, right, if you want the most baseline explanation of this, it's that they have less brains to get bashed in over time.
That's what the NFL is saying.
That's essentially the policy. They start out with less brains to destroy from tackle football.
Yeah, and to be clear, we're not talking about education here, okay? We're talking about cognitive ability, meaning if you have a CPU and a computer, how fast is your computer chip? That has nothing to do with how much education you have, how much school you went to, because I think what you could statistically prove on a sort of a general nationwide basis is that I think the lower income levels of society, generally speaking, have less education than people in higher income. For a variety of and that you can statistically prove. But what is total nonsense is saying the CPU inside your head processes faster if you're of one ethnic group as compared to the other. That has no basis in scientific reality at all. And like I said, it's against the law. It's unconstitutional in almost every state for businesses to discriminate on the basis of ethnicity. So I think if you wanted to come up with you could come up with a lawsuit and win on this. I think in probably every jurisdiction. It's amazing, and the real question then is how do you correct it? What do you do? I mean, they're going to have to go back and probably recalculate a bunch of damage awards, and then probably put more money in the pot as a result.
I was going to say, it's probably going to cost the NFL more in the long run here, whether it's in back payouts or, who knows if this even potentially blows up the entire settlement at some point. If it gets challenged enough and it has to be revisited, and the amount's certainly not going to go down.
I think the NFL would be really dumb to fight this at all. If it were me, my advice to him, I think, would be let's just unzip our fly, say we screwed up, say whatever you want, say we didn't understand what was going on, blame some insurance guys, whatever you want, but just admit it now and say we should never have done this. We're going to correct it. We're going to throw money in it, and we're going to pay everybody what they are properly owed. Because I think the PR hit in this woke, everything's woke society stuff, which just makes me want to hang myself. The NFL does not want to be seen as the opposite of progress. And I think we can all agree out there, 100% of us ought to agree that this is wrong. There's no justification for it. So the NFL, I think, they would be wise to just fix it now and not fight it. That would be my advice.
I find it amazing. And yes, you're right. Maybe this was so buried in medical and insurance and legal esoterica that no one paid attention. I find that a bit doubtful.
I'm grasping at straws here. That's the only explanation I come, because I don't think like Roger Goodell would go, yeah, we're going to pay black players less.
Right.
I don't go to that level of nefariety.
But you have to wonder, like, whoever is sitting around a decision table, which may not have been Roger Goodell at that point in terms of, hammering these details out.
It's definitely not Roger Goodell.
No. But you imagine people sitting around a boardroom, right? And, even if they're all sitting around that table wearing white hoods, and you think, are we really going to base payouts on race? Like, what kind of, even if it's most cynical read, you just would I don't think that's a winner legally. We're going to get dinged for this later. Like, who lets that through? It's bizarre.
At a minimum, like you just said, counsel ought to say, hold on a minute. There's no way we can ever get away with this. No way we'll ever get away. We were going to lose in court. The Supreme Court just had an opinion, just expanded the number of protected classes under the Constitution by adding LBGTQ, whatever the letters are, to it. Last year? There's no court is going to let you win on this anywhere, even in the heart of the South, in the most racist place you could contemplate. You're not going to win on this ever. So I tend to think that these are probably like insurance administrator, actuarial type people that are administering the damage award program. Because what's going on here is there's somewhere the NFL's escrowed all this money. And maybe it might be in chunks. I'm not saying they dumped $5 billion at once. there's some process to it, and there's probably some third party that's administering it. Would be my guess. They've probably hired some company to do it, because the NFL's not doing this out of their front. The NFL doesn't have like an office probably of like 3 people who are writing checks. My guess is they've dumped it into a fund. They have some insurance company type group that's doing this for them on their behalf, I would assume. And so I think that's probably who's doing this. And I don't think, if you go to like Robert Kraft probably had no clue about any of this, would be my guess.
Yeah, who knows? I think this is
I don't
gonna
know.
be a slow
I'm
rolling
speculating
story.
here.
I think we'll
But
know.
I just think, yeah, the NFL owners would be smart enough to know we can't do this. I hope.
Yeah, and we'll see. I think this is one of those ones where it'll be a drip, right? Like we'll get. I mean, eventually we'll know. I think it might even take a couple years and different varieties of these lawsuits. But I think this is. Yeah, I would be shaking in my boots at the NFL office. I mean, this really puts them in a risk, opens up them wide to risk.
Well, here's the next part where I want to go with this: is the coverage. I mean, I saw the story on ESPN. I haven't heard much about this on sports talk radio or anything, and it makes me wonder. I'm curious about your opinion. It makes me wonder if ESPN at least is softballing us a bit, because out of fear of them getting crosswise with the NFL, who is paying them billions. There's billions of dollars going back and forth. ESPN's paying them a lot of money. And the NFL relies on them for broadcasting. I kind of wonder if this story is being softballed a little bit because of the business relationship between the networks.
Well, I think without a doubt that the NFL is so powerful and such the king of the hill that anybody who has a relationship with them is thinking twice about any kind of coverage always. It's just I think that's it'd be difficult to argue against. It doesn't mean they don't ultimately make editorial decisions that take on the NFL. I'm not saying that they're all shaking in their boots, but it is every time something like this comes up with a media company or conglomerate or whatever that has a relationship with the NFL, there's someone that they sit around and go, is this story worth pursuing? So I think undoubtedly that's part of the discussion of any of this kind of coverage. And, obviously I'm a lot more open to wokeness than Steve. But I do think what's interesting to me is, too, it's much easier to talk about the appropriate use of the word thug, right? Or these kind of like tertiary or like kind of edgy type of things around discussions of race. But you actually get to something that's this systemic, this ingrained, this complicated, quite frankly. And it's just harder to talk about, right? And it actually, the distraction conversations, I think, are also what mutes this kind of conversation, where you can actually look like this is black and white. It's science. It's payouts. Like these are making decisions. Like at its core, this is race-based decisions. It's not a gray area. It's not a use of language. It's not the nuance of difference of opinions. So, and I think those are hard. Ultimately, NFL, no NFL, they're harder stories to cover, and I think we don't, and they're harder for people to understand, and that's just not what gets coverage.
Well, yeah, I think it's a harder story to cover. I think it's a far more important story.
Oh, for sure.
Like, I'm not wholly interested in the use of the word thug. I think all that's pretty stupid, and people just need to get over themselves a lot. But this is way more, because this is open, blatant discrimination that has a direct financial impact on the settlement plaintiffs, the class members, rather. So it's far more important than those discussions. And yeah, I think we could it's an easier discussion if you want to talk about the use of the word thug or whatever. I'm happy to, we can do that. And I think I'm far less open to that stuff than you are, and we can have a difference of opinion, and it's fine. But this is way more important. And if you want to talk about systemic, this is a system. I think the systemic racism argument, and I don't want to get into that here, it's dramatically overused, and it's way too broad and all of that, but this is what we're talking about, here. So I just find it interesting that it's not really getting as much coverage as I would have thought. I think if, for example, I don't even want to pick a company a company in the public consciousness that was doing this. That's not the NFL. It doesn't have. It was not one of the biggest industries in the country. That doesn't have billions of dollars going back and forth between TV networks. Pick your company, an oil company that's doing this.
Well, an HMO, right? That's making these kind of medical decisions on their payouts.
It would lead every network, every news story. And here it's just kind of not. ESPN and others published a story, and that was it. And I think it's because they're terrified of taking on the NFL.
Hard to disagree. And what's super, obviously it's much easier for Max Kellerman and Stephen A. Smith to, fill 40 minutes on a daily on something like the, use of the word thug. It's much different. It's much harder for them to opine and yell about the, medical issues, cognitive understanding, actuarial payouts, so there is part of that. And what's interesting to me in terms of the systemic racism part is we can have those debates. We can debate the level of systemic racism, but then when a story like this pops, it's hard, that's where it's like, wow, there it is, right? So, if you're making the case for rampant systemic racism, then here you go. There you go. That's what keeps these things front and center. And I just find it amazing that this, and also I find it amazing it took 6-7 years for this to emerge.
Well, number one, I think part of it is that this is a hard conversation to have in that, I hate to burst any bubbles out there, but a lot of these talking heads on the national media aren't that bright. They're just charismatic and can babble, but they're not that intelligent. And this is not an easy thing to understand and explain. And so I think like your Max Kellermans of the world wouldn't do a very good job of discussing it because they don't have a clue about any of this stuff. And so that may be what you were talking about, what you meant about have a hard discussion. So yeah, there's that. I forgot my second point. I can't remember, Chris. It went out of my head. Something on the basis of what you just said. I was trying to make a point about it, and I can't remember. So I will defer.
Yeah, well, think about the.
I will yield back my time to the chair.
Well, think about the things you need to know to discuss this story, intelligently, which we may be even barely doing. But right. Medical, legal, even. High level insurance. These are all advanced degree type of spaces, right?
Well, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah. Max Kellerman is a dude who
does not have a law degree,
sounds good, knows boxing.
Yeah,
that's it. Stephen A. Smith knows basketball and can talk. And I'm not picking on them in particular, although I hate everything about Max Kellerman, drives me insane. But guys like that just aren't qualified to have this discussion. None of these guys are. Somebody like Darren Ravel would be who I would start with. If you want to have like a discussion about this with a media member, you have to get to somebody at that level, not just like Shannon Sharp, out there sandbagging Julio Jones. He would have nothing to say about this,
That story is probably too far in the past, but just as a little side, I find that story amazing that he did that.
We talked about it on the Hog Side last week.
Yeah, that's wow. Anyway, before we move on to our next story, we should at least mention the Washington football team connection to this story.
I'm blanking on this totally, Chris. You have to help me out.
The wife of former at that point, Redskins running back Ken Jenkins, I think, who I barely remember. Is leading
there you go.
The legal claims for this. And was sort of like kind of seems like it started a little bit from wives talking. Like, what the hell? Why aren't we qualifying? So it almost seemed like wives organizing, and then one of those wives, the Ken Jenkins wife, I guess is a lawyer. I'm not exactly sure. I might be misspeaking. But she's basically been banging the drum and probably brought this forward.
It's funny you say that, and the reason why I blanked on that is I saw Ken Jenkins' wife was involved. I totally blanked on the fact that he was a Redskin.
Yeah, I was like, wait, who?
Yeah, that's a good point out. I'd forgotten all about that. Yeah, because his wife is the one who's right in the middle of this. And if I had, like I said, the impetus of the story is Najee Davenport and Kevin Henry's lawsuit. I don't know how they figured it out. This is I'd be fascinated to know the details of how this came to light, how those two guys and or their financial advisors or whoever else realized that there was a problem and dug into it enough to be able to file a lawsuit and have enough facts to make a claim that stood up and didn't get dismissed. I'd be interested to know how they did it.
I think we've talked about like the sort of relatively quiet media coverage. It almost seemed to be a little bit more of a news story than a sports news story I saw in some of the coverage, actually. But which is probably appropriate. But I think this one's got legs. I think this is a slower but a grower.
Because you want, again, like we said, you want discrimination that's statistically provable and legally provable. This is your story. This isn't just media nonsense. This isn't, factless accusations of racial discrimination. This isn't discrimination that has emotion behind it and not logic. This is literally financial discrimination expressly based on ethnicity.
Right.
This is
legislated
it.
in policy.
Yes. This is it. So, yeah, I do think this has legs. I don't think the sports networks are going to be able to cover this properly because, as I said, none of them understand this. None of them are smart enough to do this except for a handful of, like, sports business lawyer types. And so I do think it's a news media story. But even then, you still have, like NBC, or they're a bad example. Fox Network has a massive contract with the NFL. Is Fox News, just to pull out a random network, going to be strong enough to cover this properly? I mean, pick your network. CBS, whoever else. The ABC with the connection to Disney. Are they really going to cover this appropriately given the billions of dollars that are going back and forth? They should. But will they? That's what I'm interested to see.
And there's a lot of interesting corporate decision making, right? So if you think about Disney, which owns obviously ABC and ESPN, so does ESPN say, well, it's a bit of a hot potato, but that doesn't mean, so do they say let the ABC News team handle it? But they're the same. It's all the same corporate boardroom.
That's my point.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, that's what's fascinating about it. Yes, it is the same. And I use the Fox example. The parent company of Fox owns the Fox Sports Network and the Fox Media TV Network and Fox News. Are they going to be able to cover it? I forget who owns CBS, but I mean, it's the
Paramount.
Yeah, okay. I mean, is Paramount going to take the hit? I mean, that's the other part. Part one is, I think we can all agree that this is wrong, but the interesting part is, one, what will the NFL do about it? And two, why is the media coverage so kind of blasé, for lack of a better term? And I think the reason is everybody's afraid of the NFL.
And we got to move on here in a second. But the other fascinating thing here in terms of that, just sort of like the head scratcher part for the NFL here is you'd kind of put the concussion story to bed. Amazingly enough, they survived it to a degree. They paid their penalty, whatever. So not only do you have this whole kind of race issue, it also just puts their concussion problems front and center back. It just brings that back too, which is so potentially it's a double whammy for the NFL.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of these players have been claiming for years, I think with some amount of justification, the NFL has treated black players differently. Look at in the evaluation of quarterbacks. How many running backs started out as quarterbacks who are African American? I mean, there's been these kind of allegations for years, and this is just feeding the story correctly.
Yeah.
In this case.
No, this is
Well, stay tuned for this.
Yeah, let's move on to this topic. Should college sports stars be able to monetize their Twitch streams? Which is this this is a story we've been following for a while now, and is another one that's just gonna put off stories here for years to come, and that is this issue of what is now kind of fast marching towards the norm in many states, that allows college athletes to monetize and to benefit from their image likeness of themselves as personalities and sports stars outside of being paid to perform on the field. Steve, why don't you give us an update just on legally where we are?
Yeah, so first of all, if you want to read about this, I would start with The Athletic. Thursday, June 3rd, name, image, and likeness, what it means, why it matters, and how it will impact the NCAA and college sports. And so here's what's going on. Right now, at this moment, and historically, since the beginning, the NCAA has had rules that have prevented, one, players from being paid by universities, and two, players from getting paid by outside sources, either through employment or contracts. The idea was to preserve amateurism by keeping money out of college athletics. When, as we've talked about many times, that's laughable because there's so much money involved anyway. But when we covered this at first, 2 years ago, I think?
Yeah, probably.
Weirdly enough, the state of California actually did something right. And they're the ones that started this by passing a state law that said in the state of California, all amateur athletes can go out and sell their name, image, and likeness. So we're carving out and not discussing the idea of paying players for performance on the field. This is only about the external money coming to the player, okay? So the reason why this is a story now is that the California law statute that they passed did not take effect immediately. It took effect in 2023, but on the basis of what California did, several states, 18 different states, all passed different laws. And so there are a handful, six states in which their law comes into effect on July 1st of this year, meaning 26 days from the day we're recording. Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, New Mexico, and then Arizona is July 23rd. And then there's several other states that have statutes coming in the next year or two. And so there's a decision point within the NCAA, because right now we have NCAA rules that say you can't do this. But state law trumps NCAA rules. And so the players can. The question is then how does the NCAA treat it? The problem being is now that you have a bunch of different rules from a bunch of different states, what happens? You know, is the NCAA going to allow athletes in the state of Alabama, most prominently the University of Alabama and the University of Auburn, to make money, whereas in New York, Syracuse players can't do this? That's not equitable either. Now, where I disagree with the story is basically implying that we need federal legislation on this. The federal government can't solve all your problems, people. This is easily solved. We don't need federal legislation. The NCAA just needs to change their rule that simply says, within these boundaries and within these guidelines, players can contract with third parties to sell their name, image, and likeness. Now, from a part of me, the free market capitalist in me says this is great, so don't misunderstand what I'm about to say. Part of me, the education part of me, says it's probably not the greatest idea in the world to have multimillionaire athletes rolling around campus, but that ship sailed already, a long time ago. And college football in particular is not about education anyway. So I think if you're a free market capitalist fan, as am I, you will say it's a great thing if somebody's allowed to sell their name, image, and likeness and earn what the market bears. There's no problem with it. But the answer here is simple. We don't need the federal government to pass a law. There's no need for that. The NCAA just needs to do the right thing and say everybody can do this, period. Within some carve out like boosters, whatever you want. But the NCAA just needs to pass a rule, and that's what everybody's waiting on. So that's sort of what's going on.
This is such a fascinating story to me, and I'm not suggesting we dive too deep into this, but this is one of those, and when we live in such a binary right-left world, stories that completely wipe clean those kind of A-B, like real kind of simple ways to look at issues fascinate me, because this one just scrambles all, kinds of thoughts about like right, left, political ideology, not necessarily policy. Oh, policy too. So that's just fine. I find that fascinating just as a big idea. But I have a few things on this. One, let's look at the states that are going to will be legal as August 1st. And that's even by a couple weeks. Getting ready for college football season. Alabama, Florida, and Georgia.
Half the SEC,
yeah,
right?
That's
there.
the SEC, essentially.
And Mississippi, throw them in.
Right.
You got Ole Miss.
Right. So we'll start to see the implications of this, by kickoff college football season.
Well, who are the biggest stars in college football? Mostly the SEC players.
So we're going to start. So this is now a bunch of states, as Steve said. I think it's like 18 by 2025 will have these. The laws have been passed, but they won't kick in. But we don't need to wait that long. I mean, so the biggest kind of use cases will happen here, as the leaves turn color, so to speak. What I find, I would probably actually agree with you. It would seem dumb that we need to activate the federal government to step in here. I mean, it could very well happen, and I could see where in our system the articles point on that. I hope that does not happen, nor do I think it should happen. But what I find fascinating here is this, to me, is another example of the short-sightedness of the NCAA. This is their good out of jail free card. If you actually just allowed players to make money in other ways, you can sidestep all of the should we pay the players. It actually is your path to keeping your sport somewhat normal, because you let your SEC stars, get a shoe licensing deal. They probably stay in college a little longer because they can make the money, and because it's actually good for their careers, their sporting careers. We've seen in the NFL and NBA especially so many players that easily needed another year minimum in college athletics to be ready to compete at the professional level. So now you incentivize staying, which improves your sport. It means you can say you can make money, you just can't make money being paid to go to University of Georgia and to play football for us. To me, if I'm sitting in the NCAA, I'd say we should be celebrating this. We should be encouraging states to make this law. It actually benefits downfield athletics more than paying them on the field would be, because everything's local, right? If you've got if the University of Maryland has a lacrosse star that can monetize by doing an ad for a local used car lot, then great. You actually have more opportunities for the downstream athletes than obviously paying players to perform would. Just embrace it, and you pretty much, like I said, it's a get out of free, it's a golden ticket.
Of course, this, Chris, but the reason why this doesn't happen is the NCAA is run by morons. Yeah. That's truly, they're idiots. And they've caused this problem. And the other thing, the really dumb thing about all this is the NCAA's had 2 years to fix this, and they've done nothing. They could have passed a rule a year and a half ago about this and solved the problem and said, the day that the first law kicks in, this is what's, they've waited till literally the absolute. This is kind of like your calculus, your high school calculus finals the next day, and you just crack open the book at 10 o'clock the night before. That's what the NCAA has done here, and you're an idiot. Because the NCAA is just, it's a horrible organization in every respect. And as we said, I think you and I are, to speak for you in this case, Chris, I think you and I are both in favor of just getting rid of the NCAA and starting over. At least I am. No, it's funny that, what's that?
Same.
Yeah, you're right. And it's just fascinating that they didn't realize that this solves their problem. It's people will be less apt to say, "Oh God, you're taking advantage of these poor athletes." If the athletes can go out there and make a buck on their own, and then the argument may not go away, but it certainly alleviates it to a great extent. And somehow the NCAA doesn't realize this, and the people are waiting on it. I hate. This is a political conservative in me. I hate the idea of people waiting on the government, especially the federal government, to solve your problem. The federal government can't solve all your problems. The federal government's job is not to fix Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's grandmother's roof. Perhaps you ought to fix it yourself, Miss AOC, just as an example. And so, the NCAA just needs to pass a rule that says this is okay. It's simple. Do it in 5 minutes. I could write the rule right now on the fly, on the air, if I had to. So it's very interesting to me the way the NCAA has totally bungled this, totally missed the point, totally missed the concept that this is a wonderful thing for them. They've handled it in the worst way possible and waited till the absolute last month. They literally have 26 days. to figure out what to do about this.
Yeah, Alabama.
No, it's June. They have 25 days from today to figure this out.
Yeah, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, and New Mexico's laws all take in effect July 1st.
Right. 25 days, and they've literally buried their heads in the sand and done absolutely nothing. And now it's waiting till 10 o'clock to study for calculus. That's literally what's happened here.
And to your point about the federal government, this is where just another example of how dumb the NCAA is, because the author of the article is right to a degree, whether you think that should happen or not, is that if the NCAA insists on being on a crash course with this, then eventually the federal government's going to have to ask to be stepped in, and it's going to, it shouldn't necessarily, but it will eventually have to sort this out. And that's why NCAA not actually dealing with this in a reality-based way and looking at whatever it is, 18 states, they're inviting the federal government to get involved to some degree. I don't even think the federal government really wants to be involved in this, but eventually, if it's just this messy, they're the only body that's going to be able to sort this. But for the love of God, don't let it get there. It's dumb.
Yeah, it is dumb. And I would assume the holdup, like I said, is probably we don't want money in sports or in college athletics, Yeah, and you're laughing. Yeah, I misspoke, people. I probably, universities probably, like I said before, don't really want the quarterback of the Alabama football team to be driving a Ferrari to math class. I mean, and I understand that. I don't really like that either, but it's capitalism. If he's worth it, let him do it. And the fact that the NCAA doesn't recognize this is just, I don't even know what to say. It doesn't surprise me. After all the things the NCAA has done and not done and bungled, this doesn't surprise me.
No, it is remarkable and so silly. But, we talked about, a few shows ago, we talked about Trevor Lawrence's marketing ability and his earning potential outside of the actual sport, but is already manifested. Well, imagine that a year ago, 2 years ago. I mean, that's essentially what we're talking about, that he would start tapping, those revenue sources. That's the most crystal example of what, if this, let's say, let's roll the clock back, this law had taken in place, started July 1st, whatever, 2017 or something, you would have seen Trevor Lawrence start collecting those checks then.
Well, yeah, and as you said earlier, a lot of the players come out to the NFL and through the draft early because they want to take care of their families. Some of them are from low-income situations where mom and dad and or someone else needs help, and they're coming out early and basically ruining their NFL careers in the process out of a desire to help their family, and this alleviates that problem. It allows people to stay longer if they want to in college and get better, and will allow them to position themselves better for a future NFL career because they don't have to worry about taking care of mom and dad. They can contribute that income to their family as needed. I don't even want to assign a name to that. I mean, but there's a lot of players that are in that situation. And this takes care of that problem, or at least provides a potential solution to it. And so there's, other than the, we don't want a Ferrari guy driving a Ferrari between the dorms argument, that's really the only downside to this. And it's one I understand, but it just, the ship sailed. And how many of these players are getting money from boosters anyway?
Right. P.S. They already are.
Basketball.
They are driving. Of
course they are.
Yeah, so it's like, it's not suddenly like the sports cars are going to materialize overnight.
Brian Bosworth in the 80s did an article in Sports Illustrated that I remember in which there was a photograph of his Corvette.
Yeah.
He was a college kid. He couldn't afford a Corvette. Where do you think that came from? This has been going on for decades.
Yeah. Right.
And so it's the dirty little secret. That's, we talked about the basketball story a couple years ago, remember, where the FBI was investigating.
Adidas, right?
Like Nike, Adidas funneling money to play. And this has been going on forever. And just allowing these contracts to be above board and legal or in accordance with the NCAA rules, also takes the nefarious aspect, element out of it.
Yeah, I was just going to say,
because you don't need to do it under the table.
NCAA, if you want to wipe away 3/4 of the scammy booster culture, this is
how to
another
do it.
golden ticket.
They're handing you a solution, and you just don't understand it, don't see it, and don't understand it. It's the NCAA is just run by absolute, just incomprehensibly stupid people.
So yeah, and I think this is a deep threat to them that doesn't have to be, because it will take them down. I think I really think, like, you can pay the players whatever you can. That's difficult to do, on ways we've discussed, and it's also culturally, and amateur athletics, it's also like a big just kind of cultural shift and yada yada. So they can always hide in that argument. You can't hide from this argument. I mean, just talk to somebody. Just talk to the quarterback of the University of Florida on August 1st.
Yeah, and if they don't do something about it, it could take them down. If they just ignore this and pretend it doesn't happen, they literally have 3.5 weeks to fix this. And if they just do nothing, there's an automatic conflict going on that they've created by their ignoring the problem.
And think of the recruiting advantage now that these universities in these states have.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Of course. I mean, why would you go to UCLA if you can go to Alabama and make money? A lot of money, of course. And we're talking about the Trevor Lawrences of the world just because they're in the public eye. But as you said, the women's softball team may be able to get, a bunch of local car dealership ads because they're a big deal in their local college town because they're a good team. And yeah, nobody pays attention to it nationally, but they're not going to make millions of dollars, but they can make some money on the side. And it trickles down to everybody.
Well, hopefully. Well, actually, maybe if you're rooting for the demise of the NCAA, maybe not hopefully, they won't be, because this may be an arrow to the heart eventually. But you would hope that there is some semblance of a brain somewhere that says, you know what, we can't win here. Let's just embrace it and move on.
They haven't shown the brain, revealed the brain yet.
Yes, the precedent would not suggest that that's going to happen. All right, so
yep.
We'll move to shots and horses behinds here and talk a little Bob Baffert, who was, he was suspended by Churchill Downs for 2 years on the second positive test on his Kentucky Derby winning horse.
Yeah. So Bob Baffert is the biggest name in horse racing. A horse called Medina Spirit won the Kentucky Derby and immediately failed a drug test. Now, for some weird reason, they test these horses after instead of beforehand, which is, again, talk about dumb. I don't quite understand that, but that's the process, because you could just test them beforehand and then just eliminate them, say you can't run in the race. So instead, now you have a problem. But so they retested the horse again, and the results were released this week, and Medina Spirit failed the second test. And so as a result, Baffert has been suspended for 2 years, and the horse lost the Kentucky Derby crown. Now, Baffert getting kicked out of horse racing for 2 years is sort of like the Patriots not being allowed to play in the NFL. He's the biggest name. But here's my question, and we talked about this off the air, but did anybody believe that this wasn't happening? Did anybody believe that, especially Bob Baffert, who somehow magically finds the best horses every year, did anybody think they weren't shooting these horses full of drugs? Obviously, this has been, it seems obvious that this has been happening. There's all sorts of sleazy stuff that's gone on in horse racing for decades. This is a sport that puts horses down live on the track in front of the crowd by just putting a curtain around them. Tons of nefarious things have been going on in horse racing. So this doesn't surprise me in any way. I do think it's from a marketing standpoint, it's a big blow to not have Bob Baffert around, because he's the name everybody. If anybody knows one thing about horse racing, it's probably that name. And now he's gone for 2 years. So it makes me wonder about the viability of the sport in the public eye for the next little bit.
Now, Steve, I'm asking you a question. is he banned from horse racing writ large or just the Kentucky Derby?
Churchill Downs has suspended him for 2 years. So there is not a governing body of horse racing that I'm aware of. But my point with this is that name another race but the Triple Crown. The only thing you could get to is now the name is even. What's the other thing that's in the horse racing news every year? There's one other race.
I don't even know.
Oh, I can't. It's totally escaping my Breeders' Cup.
Right.
The Breeders' Cup's the only other thing people know. So by taking Bob Baffert out of the Kentucky Derby and essentially out of the Triple Crown, that is the sport.
Yeah, and the rest will follow suit. They'll follow the leader here, probably.
Yeah, of course they will. Right, of course. And so, no, he's not banned from all horse racing, but he's banned from the only horse racing that anybody cares about, unless you're a bettor, out there.
I mean, it's really. We just talked again a few shows ago about the good ratings for the Kentucky Derby and our sports ratings back, and that was a sign. And man, and it was literally 2 or 3 days later that first test popped. So tough look for horse racing there. They had about 48 hours of feeling like they were back.
Yeah, and yes, and so now you've got the public doubting the veracity of the sport, and then you've lost the biggest name in the sport, all in one blow. But again, I mean, does anybody believe that this wasn't going on? Baffert just got caught. I find it difficult to believe that not every horse out there wasn't being shot up with something.
Oh, of course. I mean, it's fascinating to me. If you look at the history of the United States and sports, even kind of pre-baseball, boxing and horse racing were the marquee sports, for a large stretch of time in terms of the American consciousness. And, that's reason why something like the Triple Crown still has as much cultural cachet, or a heavyweight champion of the world for that matter. Though both those sports essentially were propped up by organized crime. With that, and that's not really even debatable. One of my favorite gangsters of all time, Arnold Rothstein, basically, funded all horse racing on the East Coast. And basically invented the circuit of the sport. So it is. It's always been there, and so they're always looking. Whatever the edge is, right? Obviously, in 1890, the edge was not anabolic steroids, but those things have always been there. And I think it brings back this interesting debate about, what is a performance enhancing drug? What is there a difference? And yes, you can argue there is, but is there a difference between, shooting up a horse with performance enhancing drugs and an engineering department optimizing the wheel on a NASCAR car? This is where it gets interesting.
Well, yeah, the ethical question is different because it's a living.
Right.
It's not only it's a living thing, but it's a living thing that doesn't have a choice.
Right. It's not Lance Armstrong.
Like you could argue that the football players who are taking HGH are adults who are making a choice about their health. As long as they have the information in front of them, I'm not sure anybody should really tell them that they can't do it. But these horses, like PETA is not running horse racing, okay? I don't think the people who are making horses run full speed around a track for 2.5 minutes care a whole heck of a lot about the health and well-being of these horses.
No. And the horse had no decision of whether they were going to be a racehorse either,
Of course. Right. And so the ethical dilemma here is you're shooting horses up that don't have the ability to say no. I don't want to do this. And for that matter, as you said, don't have the ability to say I don't really want to race. They're going to do it, or they're going to take the business end of a shotgun or a needle, which is what they do. They put these horses down. So that's the dilemma. I think from an ethical standpoint, is it right to shoot animals up, whereas human beings can make it? Roger Clemens made a decision to stick a needle in his butt, and is that wrong? Maybe, maybe not, but it's definitely wrong ethically to shoot horses up when the horses aren't making a decision on their own because they're not capable of it.
Yeah, I do think we're going to have to. I think the sports writ large is going to have to decide, recalibrate what is performance enhancing and what is not.
I mean, the problem is you don't want a bunch of Ivan Dragos out there, and that's not entertaining. It's not reality, because I think the part of the allure of sports to me is it's just people, you can kind of picture yourself doing it. Like every kid out there dreams of being, not every, but a lot of kids out there, I did, dreamed of being professional football players or baseball players or basketball players. And you can kind of see a little bit of yourself out there doing it. But if they're a bunch of drugged up robots, that takes away a little bit of the humanity of the experience. And I think it hurts the sport kind of at large if you have that. And that's sort of from a baseline marketing standpoint is, I think, why you don't want it.
Yeah, I told people as late as the 6th grade that I wanted to grow up to be a professional hockey player, and I had literally never been on a pair of ice skates.
Hell, I've said on the Hogstye this year that I'm waiting to be drafted.
So where does...
And I still think it's going to happen.
Right, just give me a chance, coach.
Exactly.
What is... So do you think this is a shrug for the sport ultimately, because most people just sort of assume this, you got caught or whatever, or where does the sport go by next spring? No one cares.
I don't think it's a shrug because it's Bob Baffert. I think it was some other name that nobody cared about. Yeah, it'd be a shrug. But we're talking about Tom Brady, the Tom Brady of horse racing, going down for cheating, and I do think it's a big blow. I do think it's going to hurt the sport. I don't know what's going to happen next year, but this is going to be the story of the Kentucky Derby next year. It's not going to go away. It'll go away for the time being. Like the Belmont, by the time you hear this, the Belmont would have already been run. But nobody cares about the Belmont this year because there's not a Triple Crown at stake. So the next time people care about horse racing would be the Breeders' Cup in a couple months, which 10 people care about. And then the next story is going to be next April, the Kentucky Derby, and the only story is going to be Bob Baffert isn't here because he's cheating, not the greatness of horse racing. It'll be him. So I do think it is a big blow because of him in particular.
Yeah, no, I think if you showed people a picture of his silver hair and sunglasses and said, do you have any recollection of who this person is? You'd see, I don't know if it's a majority, but a significant people would say, I think he has something to do with horse racing.
He's the only one in the entire sport anybody would know.
Yeah, for sure. Right. The next thing people know is, fancy hats.
Maybe the only other name people know is Secretariat, which is a horse that's dead.
Right. Or Seabiscuit if they saw the movie or read the book.
Right.
And they'd like to drink mint juleps. So,
yeah.
Right. So yeah, no, I think it's super. I think it's super interesting, and he had a lot of bravado after the first test, but the second test really cut him low.
Well, he also was kind of dancing around it. He at one point said it was like a cream they're rubbing on the horse for, or not a cream. I think it was like a rehabilitation thing or something. I think he said. Then he said it was something in the stalls, and I'm getting it wrong, but he had like a bunch of weird explanations that made no sense for it, and he should have just said, "I'm always in favor. Just take your lumps. Just say, hey, we did it. Whoops, sorry." It's always better, people, if you don't just dance around the truth.
Right. And say, hey.
We did it.
And if you want to have some defense, you just say, hey, to compete, we have to do it because everyone's doing it. And just blow it over.
Yeah, but he never did that. Again, he had multiple conflicting, weird explanations that made it, again, one of them was something about it's like the hay in the stall or something, and that one was something like it was this thing we were giving him that we thought was okay, that was like for like rehab or so, I can't remember, but it was stuff that was stupid and everybody saw right through it immediately.
Yeah, it's like the pro football player or any pro athlete that says, I didn't read the small print on the protein powder I used.
That was what Baffert was doing.
Yeah, basically. Yes. All right, so it's super interesting. We have to pour one out for the horse who had no decision making anywhere, and now is stripped of his crown.
The horse is like shaking his head, going, "Man, I had it all, and now I'm just gonna have to go to stud, and retire and impregnate 100 different horses. Woe is me."
Right. The horse just knows he's stopped getting pricked
because. Like if you look at like the way you breed cattle, it's all like artificially done or like workhorse and stuff. But horses, for the horse racing industry, the breeding has to be done naturally. That's a part of the rules. You can't, like if I saw a documentary on I guess those cows, and they're literally taking artificial samples, and people are sticking entire arms up places that you would never want to stick an arm, and all these things. That's not a horse racing; it's just natural breeding. And so, like, if the horse has to retire to stud, and oh tragedy,
just open up the gate, right? Let them be in the same pasture. All right. Well, so I think when we start commenting on animal sex, it's time to wrap up the show. Is there usually a good indication?
Definitely.
Yeah. So Steve, tell us about the hog size quiet season.
Yeah, we are obviously in June, which is a quiet part of the NFL schedule, but never fear, people, because we will continue on. We have our annual position group breakdown series we're doing. Seasons of Discontent with Rick Snyder is back. They are doing two 15-minute shows a week. Rick would ask you to direct your attention to his YouTube channel to get that. And we have all of our great written content. We have something new for you guys almost every single day.
All right. Well, there you go. And so we will see you in 2 weeks.